All right. So did everyone able to see the PowerPoint? Let me know if you have or you haven't. Again, it's on Moodle week 14. Geez, week 14 already. All right. Isabella's got it. Anybody else?
You got it.
Okay, cool, Alex. Sweet. All right. Well, like I said, let's go ahead and get started with that. And Mackenzie's got it. And okay. All right. So hopefully you guys went through. Sorry about last week. Yeah, my stomach's been jacked up for the past like 2 weeks. And so yeah, it's just been miserable trying to figure out what's going on in there. But again, like with all things during the season, we'll get through. We'll figure it out. But with this introduction to Deuteronomy, which I'll do a little bit of it, and then we'll jump into what I do want to talk about for today, specifically with Deuteronomy chapter 5 through 11, and what we're going to be looking at for this week's discussion online. If you haven't seen the PowerPoints yet, Deuteronomy itself, even just from the name, you have two words that are in there. One of them, which is deuteros. I'll do this for you guys real quick. You have deuteros, which in Greek means two. That's the number two in Greek. And then you have nomos, which means law. So it's this second giving of the law that is after the second generation had been killed off or had died in the wilderness. Yahweh is now going to start up with this second generation. He's going to start with this new kind of people that are out there. So let me go ahead and share this with you guys. There, can you guys see that? There we go. So let me do this a little bigger. So you have Deutero, which means two, and then you have Nomos, which means law. And so it's second giving of the law. And this is going to be specifically for the new generation after the old generation died in the wilderness. Except for there's going to be two characters that do come out of this, except Joshua and Caleb. That even Moses and Aaron, leaders of Israel, are going to be fall prey because of their rebellion. And we talked about it with last class with last week with Moses' rebellion. Not Moses' rebellion, but the people's rebellion, and then how it slowly works itself up towards Miriam and Aaron start to complain about Moses' wife, and then Moses himself, who doesn't obey what Yahweh's commanded of him. But some of the nuances, again, with that complaining was that it's not just complaining that gets them in trouble, but it's a kind of faithless rebellion. That does end up getting them in trouble. That again, they're under covenant to a king, and what they're essentially saying, which is why I had you guys focus on some of those words, and that specific passage was for the fact that what they're essentially saying is that Yahweh, you suck. We were better off under Pharaoh. We remember the sweet life of eating melons, cucumbers, onions, leeks, had everything at their fingertips. Of course, they forget their oppression. But again, that what the heart of what they were trying to say is that Yahweh, you're not doing a good job. Pharaoh was better. And so you could start to see why it's so impactful for the people, and why that narrative kind of stings a little bit more, especially when you start to consider the context of covenant and the context of what had just occurred a few months before, which specifically was the Exodus event. And so the fact that the people so quickly forget, it will become a theme that becomes, it does become very predominant in Judges, but all throughout Israel's history, where they're going to become, it's going to be difficult for them to remember not just the Lord, remember covenant, remember Yahweh's teaching, which is why, again and again, especially as we'll jump into Deuteronomy 5 through 11 today, why there's such an emphasis on not just God's word and just saying just general Bible, but specific to Torah, which means God's teaching. And I'll put that on there for you guys. And especially moving forward, as you go through other classes like Kings of Prophets, as you guys go through, I think some of you might be, if not all, will be going to Synoptic Gospels. When you start seeing Jesus' interpretations of Torah, and then with the prophets, what they're gonna be doing over and over and over again are calling them back to covenant and calling them back to ways of observing the Torah, which we're going to talk about today, why that's such an emphasis already beginning with Pentateuch and how that thing gets expanded. I won't get into how it's expanded later on, but at least to be able to lay the foundation for us and to be able to understand why for Israel is it such a huge point for them to have this Torah not just memorized, but why it's so central in their thinking, in their worship, and in their ethics. So if you guys go over to the PowerPoint, you guys will see there. Let me share this real quick again. You guys will see right there, Deuteronomy, that it does break up with that middle section. And what I do want to focus on is more of this part in here, where you have the Decalogue, which is going to be, we talked about with the 10 words, and Deca meaning 10, Logos meaning law, or Logos meaning words, or word. So you have the Decalogue, and then love, which we'll talk about, and then don't forget. And I'll talk about the importance of and the role of remembrance as we move along. So Deuteronomy chapter 5, that you have, go ahead and read from it if you guys are there. If you guys have your Bibles. If not, go ahead and look over at Bible Gateway or your Bible apps on your phones. Going over to Deuteronomy 5. Oh, the music's still on in the back. So pleasant, I forgot it was on. All right. So Deuteronomy chapter 5. Moses convened all Israel and said to them, "Hear, O Israel, the statutes and ordinances that I am addressing to you today. You shall learn them and observe them diligently. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Not with our ancestors did the Lord make this covenant, but with us who are all of us here alive today." Sorry, my nose is getting itchy. "The Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the fire, and at that time I was standing between you and you, the Lord and you, to declare to you the words of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire and did not go up to the mountain. And he said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." And so what we do have starting off there in chapter 5, and that's going to kick off again the Decalogue or the 10 words. What we do have there, that you have the making or cutting of a covenant with those that are there, or those that are what Moses will say is those who are alive. Obviously, this emphasis being on the fact that the second generation are have died off, and now the Lord's starting or recreating a people for himself, starting with these 10 words. And we had talked about from the beginning that the same God who creates also liberates, the same God who liberates also creates. And so with this new generation, that Yahweh is going to be starting over with a new people. And now in order to continue on these people towards their mission, the goal of going and inhabiting the land and being a light to the nation and being God's chosen people, that he's got to reteach everything. He's got to recreate this covenant for them. And so just as we saw Moses and Yahweh start over with these after Moses shatters the tablets, after Exodus 32 with the golden calf incident, so Yahweh's going to start over with this new people. And so again, creation, you have kind of chaos or deconstruction of it, and how Yahweh is able to recreate not just out of nothing, but out of the disorder, out of the chaos. And so if we could think of rebellion as a kind of disordered state, and how Yahweh is using covenant yet again to create for himself and to recreate for himself, not just something brand spanking new, but something that was already in existence, which is covenant, and the people that are there, but he's now creating order and giving these people a place kind of in his family, bringing them in this invitation to be a part of his household. And so you have those words that are being revisited. And I know on there it asks the question, did verse 4 actually happen? That the Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain out of the fire. And what's happening there is that what Moses is doing is highlighting for the people, because it's quite well, there's two things that could have happened. One of them is that they were children and that they were face to face, but they were face to face with their parents. The other one is that what Moses is doing, or what the author of Exodus is doing, is transposing covenant language, not just for their parents, but now for this new generation. That the same Lord who spoke to your parents at covenant or at Sinai is the same one who's speaking to you now, meeting with you face to face. And so it's just kind of in place of that old generation, that what's now happening there with the new generation that's kind of is again standing in place of the old one. And so again, so revisiting the 10 words again. So just a heads up for your quiz on Sunday. I'm sorry, I just have a lot of gas this morning. For your quiz this morning, there's no quiz. For your quiz that's going to be due Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. Sorry if this gave you a slight bump in your blood pressure, but you do have some time. This and part of your readings are going to be on, are going to show up. That read the two versions of the 10 words. If you go over to the next slide, slide 4, that the 10 words that are going to be repeated for the people, that's what's going to be on the quiz. So just reading the two versions, create a list of the differences, and consider what are the differences between the two and why those might be. And I'll give you guys, for those that are here today, and those that are going to be watching this video later, a big reason for the change in the emphases are going to be because of the new generation, the experiences that have happened between what happened in Exodus 19 and 20, and then what's now happening in Deuteronomy 5, between the two poles. So considering the new context, considering the new generation, considering the new emphases, because the reason for Sabbath is going to be different. And again, it's going to be because of what's happened between the two. And just to give you guys a little bit of a kind of behind the curtain, is Sabbath in Exodus is because of creation. Sabbath in Deuteronomy is because they were once, I'll go ahead and read it for you. On the seventh day, you shall Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son, your livestock. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. So in Exodus, it's creation. In Deuteronomy, it's the Exodus event. So these are contextually conditioned laws or teachings. It's probably closer to teachings that Moses given to the people. But again, the reason for it is to help have them ingrain this Exodus event into their mind of what Yahweh has done, into this daily ritual, daily practice of their remembrance that they are no longer under a foreign king or ruler that oppresses them and puts them to endless labor. Again, this differentiation between Yahweh as king and Pharaoh as king, which comes to a head not just in the work they do, but also the rest that they enjoy. That they remember Yahweh and his redemptive event of the Exodus. Though there's creative elements within that, of Yahweh creating a people for himself, of bringing them out of, if you want to put it this way, drawing them out of the chaos or drawing them out of the oppression that is Egypt. And now he's creating for people for himself. And again, which is that's Yahweh's MO, that Yahweh draws out. He does it with Noah. He does it with Abraham. He does it. Moses is drawn up out of the water, and in the same way, so in Exodus, the Israelites are drawn from the waters or through the waters in that event. So there's a lot of themes that are going on in between. So do keep that in mind. You don't necessarily have to write that verbatim, but again, just some context as we're putting some things together for us to know, and for you to get some pieces to work with as you're looking at that. Again, consider the context, consider the events, the list of differences, and that's going to be a big one. So it's, of course, Sabbath is going to be on there because I gave it to you guys. But again, with the list of differences is going to be the context of who is being spoken to. So So that being said, I'm not going to beat that horse too much. So we're going to go over to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Are there any questions before I move on? Any questions? Got a Vietnamese coffee this morning. That thing's strong with the K. K. All right. And of course, if you guys do have questions, go ahead and just jump in, unmute your audio and jump in, ask a question. Hey, Partita, either slow down or I've got a question about this or what about this, or just type it in the chat and I'll go ahead and answer it. So that being said, go ahead and go over to Deuteronomy 6. And Deuteronomy 6 tends to be taken as a central passage in Deuteronomy for good reason, and we'll talk about why that is. So we'll start at verse 1. Now this is the commandment, or the teaching, the statutes and the ordinances. So we're starting to see some of the language that's being piled on, this teaching language. That the Lord your God charged me to teach you to observe in the land that you are about to cross into and occupy, so that you and your children and your children's children may fear the Lord your God in all the days of your life and keep all his decrees and his commandments that I am commanding you, so that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and observe them diligently, so that it may go well with you, and so that you may multiply greatly. Again, the theme of being fruitful, multiplying comes up again, and most specifically in regards to bearing children, not just some weird stuff going on, but specifically with children, greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has promised you. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children, and when you talk about them, when you're at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you rise, bind them as a sign on your hand, fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So you have Deuteronomy chapter 6, and what you'll see for the title there is the Great Shema. That what Deuteronomy chapter 6 is trying to get at, which is going to be a theme that comes up later on for Israel and why it's so central, is this devout loyalty to Yahweh and Yahweh alone. That this devout loyalty to Yahweh and Yahweh alone, which is going to be the foundation for their ethics, which we'll talk about in a little bit when we start talking about love. Because when we talk about love, it's going to be in that context of loyalty and covenant. It's not just talking about emotional, relational love. But again, foundational to Israel's ethics is the thought that what they're first and foremost called to is to be faithful. That this faithfulness to the covenant meant being faithful to Yahweh. It's not just about the keeping of the rules. It's not just the maintenance of the sacrificial system, but all those things exist in order to be in relationship with Yahweh. And I brought this up, especially when we talked about Leviticus, when we were in class, but even with Exodus, when we're talking about tabernacle, that Yahweh brings together the sacrificial system and he implements priesthood. All these things exist for the purposes of continuing relationship. The Yahweh is the one who he not just handles sin, but he provides the solutions for the issues that come up when things do. There's a disturbance in the force, or there's a disturbance in the relationship between Yahweh and the people. And so again, that what's being advised and what's being taught to the people, that what's supreme is loyalty to Yahweh over and above and beyond just the temporal, not just when they get to the land, but a continual event and process that needs to be taught. It's something that doesn't just happen. That faithfulness isn't just automatic, but something that all God's people are taught into. That we're taught to be faithful. And that's especially important. I know for me during the season, for us during the season, that when testing and trials do come, and when we feel like we're in the wilderness wandering, when it feels a lot like God forsakenness, is that's when the tests of our loyalty are tried, and that's when they happen. Um, they have the testing of Abraham's faith with his son Isaac, Israel's testing in the wilderness. Um, that these places that do come up of points of testing aren't just for God to be able to say, to kind of push us under and to see, well, let me see if you're going to perform or not, but rather to make the conscious choice and the daily decision to choose to be loyal and to be faithful, even when we don't have everything figured out. Because again, Israel's yet to go into the promised land, but yet the teaching, the command to be loyal already comes up here. And so again, that for that, so that it may go well with you, that it's usually thought or taken for granted that um, if we obey, then good things will happen, or that we'll get saved, or we'll experience blessing. Um, but it's the other way around. That obedience doesn't lead to salvation, but you guys will see that in the notes on the bottom. Obedience doesn't lead to salvation, and that obedience is the way in which we steward God's blessing well. Obedience is the way we steward God's blessing well. And so again, for Yahweh, who's desiring wholeness for his people, who's desiring justice in the land, how we go about stewarding and doing what it is that Yahweh has us to do is the way that we live as people of peace, we live as people of justice, and that it's not just an accidental byproduct of arbitrarily following some things and not others. And so again, I do want to bring this up. I had just talked about it with my wife the other day. There's I don't think there's a thought necessarily connected to it, but I know we can fall prey to the fact that when we um, I'll talk about our following of Jesus, and then I'll bring it back to this. But when we follow Jesus, that we're no longer slaves to sin, but we forget usually that other half of we're now slaves to righteousness. And of course, I'm jumping over to Romans, um, but that especially when we take a look at Old Testament context, that the people who come out of Pharaoh's rule, that they're taken as slaves, but now freed to serve Yahweh. That they still have a king, but it's transferred kingship from Pharaoh to Yahweh, so that they don't lose their status as servants. That the people never lose their status, which is why it's so significant when they rebel, and why these commands towards loyalty should have a central role and have a large impact on their fundamental understanding, not just of themselves or what they're supposed to, or what the people are supposed to do, but also that the people would understand for themselves, and for us to have an understanding, which is often difficult, that we're not just freed. God's people aren't just freed to wander around doing nothing and making it up as they go along, but that we're freed in order to serve Yahweh, which actually brings true freedom. The ways in which it goes well with us isn't just doing it however we want to do it, which is difficult, especially when we want to have things under our control. We want to have things under our thumb. We want to know exactly the ways they're going to happen and the ways things are going to turn out. And so usually for us, when it goes well for us is when things go our way. But as the text is trying to get to us, is that it goes well when we're obedient, not just when we get our own way. And so again, especially for Israel, when they're going in circumstances and conditions that very much feels like it's out of their control, the guarantee isn't so much that they're going to get blessed when they go into the land, as much as it is the Lord their God is going to be with them over and again and again and again and again. And you can think over to the passages over in Joshua, to be strong and courageous. Why? For the Lord your God is with you. And so again, that's going to be the repeated theme that's going to both happen here and what's going to happen in the Old Testament. That this promise of God's presence with his people is the thing that is meant to encourage their faithfulness as the people look back and see God's faithfulness in the past and have seen his presence as being enough, the guarantor of what God's commanded them to do and what he's given them to do as well. So are there any, I know there was a little bit of a detour, but I thought there was some meat on that rabbit enough to go down the rabbit hole. So are there any questions, comments, concerns? All right. The awkward silences. I've been well trained by our class to enjoy the awkward silences. So, um, all right, if there are no questions, then we can go ahead and can keep it moving. So specifically with the land of milk and honey, that the land is flowing in Hebrew, it's literally oozing, like it's coming up with milk and honey. So it's not literal that there's just um, cow milk just running around everywhere and honey, sticky honey just all over the floor. Um, but for the fact that milk meant having lots of cows, because obviously you need cows to lactate in order to produce milk, and or for that, then you need other lives, bulls and stuff like that, to be able to um, have that happen. And so, but what is trying to be said is what's there is that there's a lot of good land for the animals to graze, and there's a lot of good pasture. Again, for an agrarian people, what's most important is to have some land. If you don't have land, you don't have anywhere to put the animals. And so to have good grazing land for the animals is of importance. And for there's going to be lots of good land for the animals. And for honey, there's going to be lots of figs, which would be definitely good. And obviously lots of, not a lot of bees. But what that means is that the fruitfulness of the soil would also be there as well. You have lots of land, and not just little land, lots of good land. That as an agrarian society, that you need both land for your animals, but then you also need a land that's going to produce. And so this is going to be a land that's very productive. It will need some tending to, as we saw in Genesis 1 and 2, with that part of the work for humanity is to tend the land and to work the land. And likewise, when the people get to the land later on, that there is going to be some tending that needs to happen, but it's still a blessing nonetheless, that the land will produce. And mind you, that it's with obedience that the land becomes productive, and disobedience. And I don't think we're going to be able to, we'll get to curses today or maybe next week. But the land's inability to produce will be a byproduct of their disobedience. Which again, it's going to be, especially when we start talking about plagues and famine, and when people start connecting it to curses in Deuteronomy, then we have some serious issues. For one, this was part of the covenant for God's people. It wasn't just general, if Joe Schmo down the street does something wrong, then he's automatically under Deuteronomic covenant. That's not how it works. But it's very much specific to covenant and keeping their covenant obligations. And it's because of this thought and the reality that the land that God's given to his people is one that is a good land and it's able to produce. So again, very earthy. But again, if you're a farmer and you're agrarian, that's exactly what you want. That's your interests are for good land. So to jump over, now we're going to jump over to the Shema, which is Deuteronomy 6:4-5, that hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, or the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord is God alone. And that Shema Israel, it calls Israel to hear. And we had talked in other classes, but I mean, there's been a lot that's happened since, I think we talked about in Exodus with hearing and understanding, and at the start of this class with hearing and understanding. But that it's not just to hear, but to also know and to understand. And so they weren't just merely spectators at this divine show of God talking and then just listening, but they were to hear the truth that was presented before them and then respond to it. And so again, it's a more personal invitation for them to know and to understand and experience the Lord more so than just to have this set of facts, this proposition about God's personhood. That, okay, Lord is one by himself. Okay. No, but to understand again in the context of loyalty, that the Lord, that Yahweh is God, Yahweh is Yahweh is the supreme deity alone, and that to be devoted or loyal to Yahweh is what they're being told to hear, to understand, and to live into for themselves, especially as they're going to be moving more towards ethics after this. And so, um, after them being told that you're going to love the Lord your God, the Lord alone, that their call to love the Lord their God um, is going to look a little bit different than maybe what we're used to as modern Western Americans. And so if you go over to slide 10, again, because we're not necessarily in class to ask the question, what is love? You guys can go ahead and type in there, we get some interaction. So for you guys, how do you usually either define or understand love? You can either talk about it or throw it in the chat.
I think I could say like the sacrifice is something that's really important when it comes to love. Being able to sacrifice like things that you like for another person or the way that you do things for another person
Yep.
while being respectful to your own self and to that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a lot of self-giving,
Mm-hmm.
responsible self-giving. You want to put that way? Mm-hmm. Good. Anybody else? It's good. If you don't want to talk, you can throw it in the chat. It makes it a little easier. So when I was, I think it was a first or second year philosophy class, that we had talked about love in one of those classes, and the way the professor had defined it, he had taken a lot of influence from like early Greek philosophers, and the way he had understood it was to love is to will the good of the other, which I think that's what you're getting at, Alex, is to um, both to will and to do good for the other person, whoever that other person might be. Um, but then that leads you into all kinds of like rabbit trails, because then what's the good? Um, how do you know where's the line between willing and coercing? Like, I do this because it's good for you. Um, that where's the line between doing something for someone and then doing it because you want to do it for someone because you're like, this is what's good for you. And so it brings up other questions, other connotations. But you're good, because again, love is this massive, not just idea, but thing that we have to wrap our heads around and understand for ourselves, especially when it's so central to covenant and who we are as followers of Jesus. That what does it mean to love God and to love our neighbors and then to love them well? And so, if you look over at this again, the slides on PowerPoint, that to love, defined by Jeffrey Tigay, who is an Old Testament scholar. Um, that love is not simply an emotional attachment to God, but something that expresses itself in action. Many of the Hebrew words, many of the Hebrew verbs for feelings, emotions are best defined by the actions that come from them. That many of the Hebrew verbs for feelings, emotions are best defined by the actions that come from them. That love can be best described by the actions that result from love. Um, so though we might not necessarily have a specific definition for it, like we can describe the word by the actions that come from it. So Alex, you had brought up sacrifice. That well, we might not necessarily love is sacrifice, because not all sacrifice is loving, but that it's what love can look like, is a sacrifice. And so to go to the next slide, that for in love, that to love the Lord your God with all your heart, that lave the seed of your thought or intentions to love the Lord your God with all your decisions. That in Deuteronomy, that the command to love is often linked with the command to obey. And if you can think of an old Jewish rabbi that said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. That this demonstration of love is tied in with obedience. That in the simple fact that Deuteronomy's love is one that can be commanded shows that it's not just emotion, that there's something more going on. And again, demonstrated loyalty or obedience or commitment to Yahweh, which generates actions that correspond to that confession. That it's not just, I love you, God, but I do whatever it is that I want to do. It's that, Lord, I love you, and I'm doing my best to try to do what it is that you commanded me to do. And so again, especially for us as God's people that are working towards that and working towards being more and more obedient, that at least in the most basic of ways, that what ways do we demonstrate our faithfulness and obedience, and then what ways do our actions correspond with our confession of not just Yahweh being one, but that our love for Yahweh being demonstrated in our actions and our activities. So again, which is going to find its place in ethics and what we're going to wrestle with for this week. And so to love the Lord your God with all your decisions, again, that this demonstration that making decisions that aren't just going to be ones that are only fed by our own aspirations and dreams and activities, though that's really important, but then also to include Yahweh in our decision making, to include Yahweh's teaching about the decisions that we make. If we're going to rip off our neighbor, or are we going to treat them well? Are we going to cuss out other people, or are we going to speak kindly to them because the Lord's been kind to us? And so again, it deals with all these decisions that we make from the day to day, and especially with the way Israel makes their decisions, you can start seeing that it's going to get them in trouble, especially when they start to feel threatened by foreign powers. That their dependency on foreign nations is going to, that once they themselves become a power in the land, and then once they start becoming fearful of other nations, that then they're going to start. And I might talk about it for sure next week. I will, but that it's when they get into the land and they settle down that this will become a serious issue. That their decision making is going to be more based on comfort than it will be towards loyalty. That the desire is going to be to preserve themselves instead of trusting the Lord, which that's going to take precedent for them. And so again, it's the same some temptation that exists for us, that it was our desire to preserve ourselves and to preserve our comforts than it is to be loyal to take the risks. But yeah, that's what me personally, what I'm dealing with right now, me and my wife are dealing with right now, is that we're leaving a comfortable situation because we feel that the Lord's taking us somewhere else. But it's difficult. It's difficult not to freak out and try to go back. And not necessarily going back to Egypt, but to not continue to move towards obedience. But it's chaotic to move backwards. And so as tough, as difficult as it is right now, still trying to do the best we can with managing some of the anxiety and praying for peace, and letting the things that come try to drive us towards prayer and towards dependency, which is again a process and something that we have to learn. So the next one, love the Lord your God with all your soul. The Hebrew word for that is nephesh. It's the seat of the emotions, passions, desires. That it's used to express all the whole of the inner self, with all the emotions, personal characteristics. It's to love the Lord with all your personality, and love the Lord with all that you have. And so, to love the Lord with all your heart and soul. That Israel is to serve God with undivided devotion. Which again, the first command to not have any other gods, or to put any other gods before Yahweh. There's a reason that's first, because it's often what Israel wrestles with most. And so this command for them to love the Lord their God, to be single-heartedly devoted to him, corresponds to what's happening there. with the first word that's being given to Israel to be loyal, to not put any other gods before Yahweh. And so to love the Lord your God with all your might, that that to love the Lord, it's likely given here to add an emphasis that to love the Lord very, 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 very much, love the Lord exceedingly, to be devoted, exceedingly, to have a zeal, to have a passion. Excuse me. And so some interpretations of this is to love the Lord your God with all your actions, emotions, and possessions, or to love the Lord your God with your undivided devotion, even at the cost of your life. And these are some possible ways to interpret that. But again, to see the context of what's going on here in terms of loyalty, that it's important for us to understand and to know that, again, this call to undivided loyalty or devotion that is going to be tested when Israel gets into the land is going to be something that comes up again and again. Um, so I'll jump over the next slide, slide 16. You'll see Deuteronomy 6 there. What that really is, that it's not, I mean, we usually have this, Hobby Lobby makes it really easy to do this, is to post scripture around the house. We have like a banner looking thing that's stretched out of a passage in Romans over in the living room. But it's that these words that are being taught to them are meant to be carried with them, meant to be carried with the people no matter where they went, especially in the most personal of spaces like their homes. That it's in, you'll see they're called phylacteries. And they're little boxes that if you see an Orthodox Jewish person walking around, that they'll have sometimes a little box on their head and they'll have a little box on their hand, because they're taking these passages literally, that they're binding them literally on their hand, I can't think today, on their hand and then on their forehead, and then sometimes you'll see a little box above their doorpost if you go to usually a conservative Orthodox or Orthodox Jewish person's house. That you have these boxes that have little scripture, little Torahs in them, usually with the 10 words in them, or another passage or this passage in there. That is, again, serving at this as this reminder that in your thinking and in your work and in your home, that Yahweh's word, Yahweh's teaching is meant to reign supreme. That in everything that we do in our thought life and in our work life, in our home life, that these places are being filled with Yahweh's word, in order that it might produce in God's people a more faithful people, and to remind them of Yahweh's teaching and Yahweh's Torah. And so, so we go to the next slide. You'll see for the next few chapters, chapters 7 through 10, that what's going to be advised for the people is these avoiding of the dangers that to their faith and obedience. And again, I put faith there, and you can think of it as loyalty after the conquest of the land. And one of the biggest things that's going to be the biggest threats isn't just going to be the presence of people, it's going to be the presence of foreign deities and the worship of foreign deities. And so, inasmuch as the Canaanites pose some issues because they're in the land, so are the presence of foreign deities. And the sad thing is that Israel will have a very difficult time later on getting rid of the false idols. That you get to the point, again, we talked about this in Biblit with the establishment in Israel and Judah, that especially in Israel, we have Dan and Bethel and these different places. But even early on, that there is a warning in Deuteronomy 7 that when you get there, you need to get rid of the idols. Get rid of the idols. And what does Israel fail to do later on? Well, we'll see, because we're not there yet. So Deuteronomy 9 and 10. This is where we're gonna land, and we'll close out in a little bit. That for in Deuteronomy chapter 9 and 10, you have this two-chapter sermon from Moses. And one of the major themes that's going to happen there is the fact that victory is no proof or evidence of virtue. That because the people do go into the land, that's a sign more, that's more of a sign of Yahweh's faithfulness than of the people's character. And I need to bring that up because of the fact that Israel isn't brought into the land because of their strength, because of their military power, because of their wealth, that they're chosen because they're weak. And it's because of that that Yahweh then again chooses this people and then brings them into this land. So that you have this retelling of the commandments again. You have this history of the contention between Yahweh and the people, and then going into the land. That with Israel going into the land, that you have in the ancient world, especially for Israel and its neighbors, that that Israel and the nations, especially as they get into the promised land, the thought was that because Israel gets into the promised land, that they were deemed to be more righteous than the other nations that are there. That Israel lives with this kind of binary logic that if the nations were judged to be wicked, nations are wicked, so the Israelites are sent to take them out. And Israel is tools of God's judgment, which they thought means, okay, well, we as Israel are righteous then. But God's going to overlook this evaluation on both sides, that he doesn't see the binary. It's not because Israel is more righteous than any of the other nations, that the Canaanites' wickedness doesn't establish Israel's righteousness, and nor does God's use of Israel as agent of judgment assume or place Israel in the category of righteous or faithful. That again, Israel has to choose to be faithful to Yahweh. It can't just be assumed that because they have success, therefore they are now automatically righteous. They're okay with God, that they're faithful, but that their faithfulness has to be demonstrated in obedience, which is why I go back to that thing with obedience before of what love looks like. That it's not just taken as a one-time thing, you're righteous or you're faithful and that's it, just keep it moving. But that in order to proceed as righteous, that the demonstration of faithful actions then follow. And so while we might think this puts Israel at shaky footing with Yahweh, well, for one, we take Yahweh's choosing of a covenant with them as a kind of guarantee that he's with the people. But it's because he's with the people that then puts on this expectation. They've received the covenant, they've chosen to partake in it, that the people then continue on with their faithfulness and loyalty in observing the teaching that Yahweh's provided, namely the Torah. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12 to 22, you can have remembrance come up again and again and again and again. So let me go ahead and get to turn over or click over to Deuteronomy chapter 10. And this will come up for your discussion for the week and in your readings. So it'll be good for us to get to. So Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12. So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the words, the commandments of the teachings of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today for your own well-being. Although heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth with all that is in it, yet the Lord set his heart in love on your ancestors alone and chose you, their descendants, after them out of all the peoples as it is today. Circumcise then the foreskin of your heart and do not be stubborn any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the stranger, providing them food and clothing. You also shall love the stranger, for you are strangers or foreigners, immigrants in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, him alone you shall worship. To him you shall hold fast, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, he who has done for you these great and awesome things that your own eyes have seen. Your ancestors went down to Egypt, 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as stars in heaven. And so that bit of circumcise the foreskin of your heart. Did Israel practice open heart surgery? Probably not. That would probably be very difficult because circumcision is already difficult enough with sharp rocks, um, let alone trying to get into somebody's heart. Jeez, it got messy pretty quick. But anyway, so circumcision is being used here metaphorically, that circumcision is a sign of covenant membership. And we remember in Genesis 15 and 17, specifically, that where circumcision serves as the sign of the covenant. And we had talked about how it's the eternal nature of it, in that both in the cutting of it being around and the fact that you can't undo circumcision once it's already been done. And so that being said, that this idea that to cut away at one's heart, that it's in response to rebellion and in response to disobedience, which again, it's more akin to hardening one's heart or to close off one's ear. And it's usually connected to something else. But that to circumcise your heart means to open your ears and commit yourself to Yahweh. That to put aside our rebellion, to let go of our disobedience, and to be able to hear and to do what Yahweh has commanded and taught for his people to do. And so, again, that being said, this emphasis on the widows and orphans and strangers, what you guys are going to be looking at for this week is, why is there this strong emphasis? Because it doesn't just happen here, but it happens in other places in the Old Testament, where Yahweh has a specific concern for, again, for strangers, widows, and orphans, which again will come up in the New Testament in different places, but specifically here in Deuteronomy, to ask the question why these things keep on coming up. And as you guys are going through your reading, you guys will have the answers. But to go to the last slide in 23, that Moses later on is going to sum up the preamble to the laws, and all that he has said in the preceding chapters culminates in a choice between two futures: a blessed one if they choose to obey, and an accursed one if they don't. So again, that with the ethics that Israel is being encouraged towards, that there is a very specific way of living that is meant to reflect Yahweh's participation in life with the people, that it's because Yahweh's been gracious and generous with the people, then that also ought to serve as a way of living, or as a kind of ethic for the people themselves to observe and to live out as well. It's not just God did something for me, F everybody else, forget everybody else. But it's more, because Yahweh's done this for me, I now do this for other people. Because Yahweh was gracious for me in delivering us from the land of Egypt, therefore we're going to now be hospitable to those that are journeying from wherever they're journeying from. And again, that is graciousness because we've been shown grace. It's love because we've been shown love. It's showing compassion because we've been shown compassion. That's a kind of reflective ethics based on what Yahweh's done in order to live out and to respond to what Yahweh's calling us to do, both at that time and then even for the here and now, based on those kinds of ethics. And so, again, it's very much tied to their narrative of what they had experienced, and then the mode of living that Yahweh is prescribing. So, again, to put it, let me say that again. What Israel is being advised to do is based on Yahweh's character and on his activity of intervention. That Yahweh is gracious, compassionate. He's delivered from the hand of the Egyptians. Therefore, they're called to be people of hospitality or generosity. And so again, the Yahweh's character and his activity is going to dictate some of, if not all of, Israel's ethics and the way they ought to be in the world. So that being said, especially that last part, it'll be helpful for knowing and moving you forward with this week's readings and with the assignments, specifically the discussion. And then again, for the quiz, that's going to be specifically on comparing the 10 words in Deuteronomy 5 and then over in Exodus 20. as a kind of heads up. Are there any questions? Comments, concerns? All right. Well, if everyone's what's up? Go ahead, Alex.
For the online discussion, so the discussion is gonna be about the different, like the actual other reading, right? About the orphan, the widow, and the stranger.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else? All right. Well, if there's nothing else, you guys have a great, fabulous Taco Tuesday. Go out, get some coffee and a donut. Stay safe, stay healthy. Go out for a walk. Enjoy today. I think it's supposed to be sunny out today, at least in Southern California. So, yeah, you guys have a good day. See you guys soon. Hope to talk to you guys soon. So, you're welcome, Isabella. I'll see you guys.
Oh,
yeah. What's up?
random. I just remembered.
No, go ahead.
So I turned